My name is Benjamin Carver. For the past 7 years, I have served as a park ranger with the Department of the Interior. It is a profession I entered with a clear sense of purpose, an earnest belief in the mission to preserve and protect the natural and cultural treasures of this nation for the public trust. My previous posting was at a bustling urban historical site, a place of manicured lawns and predictable foot traffic, where my duties felt more administrative than custodial. I was, for all intents and purposes, a well-informed ambassador in a khaki shirt, answering questions about visitor center hours and managing permit applications. But the call of the true wilderness, the deep, untamed quiet of the American landscape, never left me. That is why I requested a transfer. The assignment to Archwood National Park, a remote posting deep in the Appalachian Mountains, was not a disciplinary action or a career dead end. It was a choice. I saw it as a return to the core tenets of the service: resource management, solitary patrol, and a profound connection to the land itself. I wanted to escape the noise, the endless stream of people, the feeling of being a cog in a machine that had grown distant from the earth it was meant to steward. I wanted the silence. I wanted the isolation. I believed, with a certainty that now seems tragically naive, that in the solitude of the mountains, I would find a more authentic version of my job, and perhaps of myself. The final 10 miles of the journey to the Archwood Ranger Station were a lesson in receding civilization. The state highway gave way to a county-maintained asphalt road, which in turn bled into a gravel track that rattled the frame of my personal vehicle. Finally, I turned onto the station's access road, an unpaved, deeply rutted path that was more of a suggestion than a road, a muddy scar carved through dense forest. The station itself emerged from the trees abruptly. It was a 1930s era log structure, a relic from the early days of the Forest Service, built for function and longevity, not comfort. The main building, comprising the living quarters and a separate office, sat on a stone foundation, its walls constructed of massive, dark, stained logs. A smaller barn and a dilapidated outbuilding stood nearby. The entire compound was dwarfed by the ancient, brooding mountains that rose up on all sides. It was the very picture of profound, unyielding isolation. Parked near the main cabin was a late 1990s Ford Ranger, its forest green paint faded and flecked with rust, the NPS shield still visible on the door. This was the government issue vehicle for the station, left behind by my predecessor. Its presence felt both mundane and vaguely unsettling. I let myself into the cabin. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The log walls were so dense that they seemed to swallow sound, creating an immediate and almost oppressive quiet. A peaceful sanctuary, I thought at the time. The place was eerily tidy, the floors swept, the sparse furniture arranged with care. Yet, there were subtle signs of a hasty departure. A coffee mug left half, full on the counter, a pair of worn hiking boots by the door, as if their owner had intended to put them on, but never did. In the office, the feeling of a life interrupted was even stronger. On the heavy wooden desk sat a standard issue NPS Field notebook, its cover adorned with the familiar arrowhead logo. Next to it lay a simple, retractable ballpoint pen, its plastic barrel imprinted with the words U.S. Government. A Skillcraft pen. I had used hundreds just like it. It was a symbol of bureaucratic normalcy, of reports filed and duties discharged. I picked up the notebook, curious about the man whose post I was taking, a ranger named Frank Merrill. The first several pages were exactly what I expected. The entries were logged in a neat, practiced cursive, the kind of disciplined penmanship taught in schools decades ago. Merrill documented trail conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife sightings with professional detachment. But as I flipped further, the character of the writing began to change. The neat loops and slants devolved into a tight, spidery scrawl. The pressure of the pen seemed to have increased, digging into the paper. The ink on these later pages looked slightly faded, almost watery in places, as if the high humidity of the mountains had begun the slow work of chemical degradation. I read a few fragmented entries, my skin prickling despite the cabin's chill. Things that wear the wrong faces in the trees. The silence isn't empty. It listens. Heard it again last night. It had my father's voice. I closed the notebook, a knot tightening in my stomach. I told myself it was the product of cabin fever, the well-documented psychological strain of long-term isolation. Merrill had clearly been out here too long. His mind had started to play tricks on him. I put the journal aside, determined to maintain my own professional objectivity. It was then, as I began my initial inventory of the station, that I found the list. It was a single sheet of paper, laminated and taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet door. The title was printed in a stark, official font, Archwood Station, Standard Operating Procedures, and AREA, Specific Mandates. It was a mix of the mundane and the profoundly strange. My training compelled me to read it, to understand the operational protocols of my new post. My rational mind tried to find logical explanations for the bizarre entries, to frame them as precautions against unusual wildlife or as concessions to local superstitions. Rule No. 1. Daily log and equipment check. All entries must be made by 0800 hours, using the provided Skillcraft pen. All equipment must be accounted for. Accountability is paramount. Missing equipment is a reportable incident. Rule No. 2A. Visitor interaction. Greet all visitors courteously. If a visitor asks for someone by a name you do not recognize, politely state they must have the wrong location. Do not offer them entry to the station. Rule No. 3. Nightly lock down all station doors and windows. Must be locked from sundown to sunrise. No exceptions. This is a primary safety protocol. Rule No. 40. Soundscape monitoring. Report any unusual acoustic phenomena in your daily log. If you hear a sound resembling a human voice, especially a child's or mechanical grinding from the woods after 200 hours, do not investigate. Engage interior sound dampeners, attic insulation baffles, and remain inside. Rule No. 5E. Trail patrols. West Ridge. Do not leave the marked trail on the West Ridge, especially near boulder fields. If you see something that looks like a deer, but its movements are wrong, or its eyes, face forward. Do not approach. Avert your gaze and return to the station immediately. Rule No. 60. Radio silence. The station's primary radio is for outgoing emergency calls only. Do not respond to any incoming transmissions that are not preceded by the regional security code, Vesper 3. This is non-negotiable. Rule No. 7. Waste disposal. All food waste must be incinerated nightly. Under no circumstances should meat, cooked or raw, be left outside or stored in the exterior shed. This is critical for predator management. Rule No. 80. The old power shed, the creosote, treated telephone pole behind the station is not to be touched or used for any purpose. The attached shed is to remain locked. Do not attempt to repair the generator within. The structure is obsolete and awaiting formal decommissioning. I read the list twice, a cold smile touching my lips. It was a masterpiece of paranoia, a formal documentation of one man's slow unraveling. Not dear, mechanical grinding. It was absurd. Clearly, Merrill had lost his grip. I resolved to follow the sensible rules, the ones that aligned with standard NPS safety protocols, and to disregard the rest as the unfortunate byproduct of a mind strained by solitude. That first night, the sun bled out behind the western peaks, plunging the valley into a profound darkness. The forest, which had been a symphony of birdsong and rustling leaves by day, fell into a deep and unnerving silence. I made my first entry in my own logbook, using the same Skillcraft pen Merrill had used. Its cheap plastic cool against my fingers. I noted my arrival, the station's condition, and the inventory of supplies. I was a professional, establishing a baseline. As I wrote, I heard it. It was a faint sound, coming from the direction of the woods behind the cabin. A soft, rhythmic scraping. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It was almost too quiet to be sure of. I held my breath, listening. The sound continued for another minute. A patient, methodical noise that had no obvious natural source. I thought of Rule 54 and felt a flash of irritation. Merrill's paranoia was already getting to me. It was probably a porcupine chewing on the logs, or a branch scraping against the eaves in a breeze I couldn't feel. I stood up and walked to the window, peering through a gap in the blinds. The security light cast a pale, sterile glow over the small clearing. There was nothing there. Just the dark wall of the forest, the silent Ford Ranger, and the looming shape of the old power shed. As I watched, the scraping sound stopped. A deep, primal unease settled into my bones. It was a feeling that bypassed logic, an ancient fear of the dark and what it might hold. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was a man of science and reason, a steward of the natural world. But when I turned away from the window, I moved through the cabin with deliberate purpose, checking the lock on the back door, then the front. I slid the deadbolts home, the metallic thump echoing in the heavy silence of the log house. I checked the latches on every window. For the first time, I was following Rule 53 not out of professional procedure, but out of a sudden, undeniable flicker of fear. The morning arrived with a gray, reluctant light that did little to dispel the shadows clinging to the corners of the cabin. I woke stiffly in my bunk, the oppressive silence of the log-walled room pressing in on me. the memory of the scraping sound, and my subsequent, almost panic. Securing of the station felt foolish in the daylight. I was a 7-year veteran of the Park Service. I had dealt with poachers, conducted search and rescue operations, and faced down my share of angry wildlife. I was not a man who gave in to childish fears of the dark. It was the isolation. I told myself, a well-documented psychological stressor. Meryl had succumbed to it, and I was simply feeling the first faint tendrils of its influence. I would not let it take root. Adherence to routine is the best defense against the unraveling of the mind in solitude. I made coffee, the aroma a small comfort of normalcy, and sat at the heavy wooden desk in the office. I opened my logbook. Rule 5.1. All entries must be made by 08 Pauser. Hours using the provided Skillcraft pen. I picked up the cheap government issue pen. Its plastic barrel cool and familiar. With a deliberate, steady hand, I logged the previous night's events, framing them in the dry, objective language of a professional report. 2215 hours, noted faint. Intermittent scraping sounds from exterior, likely animal activity. Source unconfirmed. All structures secured per protocol. I did not write about the cold knot of fear in my stomach or the way I had checked the deadbolt on the front door. Accountability, as the rule stated, was paramount. My primary duty for the day was a patrol of the West Ridge Trail, a task I approached with a renewed sense of purpose. It was an opportunity to ground myself in the tangible reality of my work. Trail maintenance, wildlife observation, the simple act of putting miles on my boots. I checked my gear, packed my standard issue field kit, and headed out. The air was crisp, the forest floor a damp tapestry of fallen leaves. For a few hours, everything felt right. This was the job I had asked for. The profound quiet of the wilderness a balm to my city, worn soul. I reached the section of the trail that wound through a series of large boulder fields. The landscape opening up to reveal stunning, hazy vistas of the surrounding peaks. And that's when I saw it. About 100 yards off the trail, standing partially obscured by a stand of young birch trees, was a deer. At first glance, it was unremarkable. But something was wrong. I stopped, raising my binoculars. Its head was turned towards me, but its body was angled away. A physical impossibility. As I watched, it took a step, a jerky, uncoordinated movement that was utterly alien to the fluid grace of a whitetail. It was as if the joints were bending in the wrong direction. Then it turned its head fully, and a spike of ice shot through my veins. Its eyes were on the front of its face. Like a wolf. Like a man. Rule 85 slammed into my mind with the force of a physical blow. If you see something that looks like a deer, but its movements are wrong, or its eyes face forward, do not approach. Avert your gaze and return to the station immediately. My training screamed at me to document, to observe, to understand this biological anomaly. But Merrill's frantic scrawl in the notebook echoed the rule. Things that wear the wrong faces in the trees. I lowered the binoculars, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not run. I turned, deliberately and without haste, and began walking back down the trail, my eyes fixed on the path in front of me. I did not look back. The feeling of those forward, facing eyes on my back was a physical weight, a pressure that didn't lift, until the ranger station was once again in sight. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. The comforting solitude I had craved now felt menacing. Every creak of the old log cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt through my nervous system. I tried to lose myself in paperwork, in organizing supplies, but my focus was shattered. I kept glancing at the laminated list of rules, taped to the cabinet door, no longer seeing them as the ravings of a disturbed mind, but as a desperate, vital warning. That night the sounds returned, but they were different. The scraping was gone. In its place, around 2300 hours, came a low, mechanical grinding noise from deep in the woods. It was a sound that had no place here, a rhythmic, industrial chugging that rose and fell in intensity. It sounded like a machine struggling to turn over, a generator fighting against rust and decay. Rule high 4A if you hear mechanical grinding from the woods after 2200 hours. Do not investigate. Engage interior sound dampeners and remain inside. I found the switch for the attic baffles, a crude, unlabeled lever near the ceiling, and pulled it. There was a soft thump from above, and the grinding noise was marginally muffled, but not gone. It was a constant, grating presence on the edge of my hearing. An hour later, the radio crackled. A burst of static. Then a voice. It was faint, distorted, and layered with static. Anybody there? Need assistance? Archwood Station. Do you copy? My hand shot towards the receiver, my training ingrained. A distress call must be answered, but my eyes fell on Rule Face 6. Do not respond to any incoming transmissions that are not preceded by the Regional Security Code, Vesper 3. This is non-negotiable. There had been no code. The voice came again, closer this time, less distorted. It was a man's voice, laced with panic. Please. I'm lost. I can see your light. I stood frozen, my knuckles white on the edge of the desk. Every instinct I had as a ranger, as a human being, urged me to reply, to offer aid. But the memory of the not dear, of its wrongness, held me in place. I let the transmission die. The silence that followed feeling heavier and more damning than the noise. The week crawled by. I performed my duties with a mechanical precision, my world shrinking to the confines of the station and the immediate, well-trod paths around it. I avoided the West Ridge. My logbook entries became more terse, the formal cursive I'd been taught evolving into a tighter, more functional script. I documented everything. Arzo 2017. Unidentified vocalizations, possibly juvenile, heard to the east. Per protocol, did not investigate. 21 Howderter. Radio transmission received, no security code. Per protocol, did not respond. I was no longer dismissing Merrill. I was becoming him. My attention became fixated on the old power shed mentioned in Rule Fate 8. It stood about 50 yards behind the main cabin, a squat, windowless structure of dark, weathered wood, leaning slightly to one side. A single, thick telephone pole, its surface black and glistening with creosote, stood beside it. A tangle of cut wires hanging from its crossbar like dead vines. The rule was explicit. The attached shed is to remain locked. Do not attempt to repair the generator within. During the day, I walked the perimeter of the shed, my boots crunching on the gravel. A heavy, rust-pitted padlock secured the door. I felt a strange, morbid curiosity about what was inside, about the generator that was not to be repaired. The air around the shed felt cold, still. The smell of creosote was sharp and chemical, an unnatural scent in the clean mountain air. On the sixth night, a torrential rain began to fall, drumming against the roof and sluicing down the windows in thick sheets. The sound was a constant roar, a welcome blanket of noise that drowned out the whispers of the forest. I felt a small measure of relief, a sense that the storm had granted me a reprieve. I was sitting at the kitchen table, cleaning my service pistol, when a new sound cut through the din of the rain. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the front door. Tap, 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 tap. I froze, the cold metal of the pistol in my hands. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a branch. It was deliberate, measured. I stood up slowly, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I crept to the peephole, my breath held tight in my chest. The security light outside illuminated a world awash in rain, the clearing a churning mess of mud and water. There was nothing on the porch, no person, no animal. Tap, tap, tap. It came again. This time on the window right next to the door. I flinched back, my gaze snapping to the glass. For a split second, through the distorted, rain-streaked pane, I saw a shape. It was tall and impossibly thin, a silhouette of stark, pale white against the raging dark. It had no discernible features, just a wrongness of form that my mind couldn't process. Then it was gone. I stood there for a long time, my back pressed against the solid log wall, the pistol held in a two-handed grip, aimed at the door. The tapping did not return. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was still out there. The rules were not for my predecessors' paranoia. They were for what was waiting in the woods. And the storm wasn't a shield. It was cover. The storm raged for the rest of the night. A relentless assault of wind and water that seemed intent on tearing the old cabin from its foundation. I didn't sleep. I sat in the main room, my back to the interior wall, my service pistol resting on the table beside me. Every crash of thunder, every gust of wind that rattled the window panes, sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through my system. The image of that pale, featureless silhouette was burned into my mind, a stark white negative against the churning darkness. The tapping had stopped, but the presence it implied felt suffocating, a patient, predatory waiting. I was no longer a steward of this park. I was a prisoner in my own station. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a world washed clean and utterly still. The rain had stopped, and a heavy mist clung to the trees, muffling all sound. I forced myself to move, my limbs stiff and protesting. My first act was to conduct a patrol of the cabin's exterior. The ground was a soft, muddy soup, and any tracks the creature might have left were gone, erased by the deluge. But at the window where the tapping had occurred, I found something. A faint, greasy residue smeared across the glass, iridescent and milky in the morning light. And below it, on the thick log of the sill, was a single deep scratch, as if something long and hard, like a shard of bone, had been dragged across the wood. The days that followed were a descent into a new kind of madness. It was not the slow, creeping paranoia of isolation I had read about. It was the sharp, vigilant terror of being hunted. I abandoned all but the most essential patrols, my world, shrinking to the clearing around the station. I spent hours poring over Merrill's journal, frantic, spidery script, now making a terrifying kind of sense. It wears their faces but gets the eyes wrong. The sound from the shed is a call. I was no longer analyzing a man's breakdown. I was studying a field guide to my own potential demise. On the 10th day of my assignment, I had a visitor. He appeared at the edge of the clearing around midday. A man who looked to be in his late 60s, dressed in worn but serviceable hiking gear. He had a kind, weathered face and a friendly smile. He walked up to the porch with an easy confidence and knocked on the door. My heart leaped into my throat. I approached the door, my hand hovering near the pistol on my hip. "Help you?" I called through the thick wood. "Howdy." The man's voice was pleasant, a gentle baritone. "Sorry to bother you. I was hiking the old logging trail over the ridge and got a bit turned around. I was looking for my friend, Frank Merrill. This is his station, isn't it? Rule A28: if a visitor asks for someone by a name you do not recognize, politely state they must have the wrong location. Do not offer them entry to the station." But I did recognize the name. This was different. This was a friend of my predecessor. My professional duty was to assist him. But the rules, Merrill's rules. "I'm sorry, sir," I said, my voice. "You must have the wrong park. There's no one by that name here." The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something crossed his eyes. Disappointment, annoyance. It was gone as quickly as it came. "Oh, well, isn't that strange? My mistake, then. Sorry to have troubled you, Ranger." He turned to leave, and I felt a wave of relief. But then he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "It's a shame," he said, his friendly tone unwavering. "Frank was always so good at keeping the machinery running. Knew that old generator like the back of his hand." He gave a final, cheerful wave and disappeared back into the trees. I stood frozen, the blood draining from my face. The generator, the grinding noise. Rule Fade 8. The attached shed is to remain locked. Do not attempt to repair the generator within. The encounter wasn't a coincidence. It was a message, a taunt. From that moment on, the old power shed became an obsession. It was the nexus of my fear, the source of the mechanical grinding, the subject of the visitor's cryptic comment. I had to know what was inside. I spent an afternoon searching the cabin, driven by a desperate need for answers. Tucked away in the back of Merrill's desk drawer, taped to the underside, I found a small, tarnished brass key. With my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I walked to the shed. The air around it felt colder, the smell of creosote sharp and cloying. The rusty padlock looked ancient, but the key slid in smoothly. With a grating screech, the lock sprang open. I pulled the heavy door, its hinges groaning in protest. The air that billowed out was a foul cocktail of smells: damp earth, rust, ozone, and something else, a coppery, metallic tang that reminded me of old blood. The interior was dark and cramped. In the center of the dirt floor sat the generator, a monstrous, grease-caked diesel, and looked like it hadn't run in 50 years. But it had been worked on recently. Wires were rerouted into strange configurations, leading to a series of crudely attached metals and coils that were not part of any standard generator assembly. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, landing on a pile of debris in the corner. There were burnt, oily rags, and scattered amongst them were spent shell casings. But they weren't from a rifle or a pistol. They were the thick plastic casings of flare cartridges. Next to them was a standard issue NPS flare gun, the kind kept in every station's emergency kit. But this one had been altered, its barrel reinforced with a crude metal sleeve. Beside it was a cardboard box. I knelt, my light trembling. The box was full of 12-gauge flares, but they weren't the standard red distress signals. Their tips were packed with a coarse, silvery, white powder, a memory from a long-forgotten Osama training course surfaced in my mind. White phosphorus, a substance that ignites on contact with air, that burns with a ferocious, blinding intensity, and that is almost impossible to extinguish. It causes horrific, deep tissue burns. This wasn't a signal gun. It was a weapon. A desperate, last-ditch weapon. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The grinding noise wasn't the generator trying to start. It was something else. Something powered by the generator. The strange modifications, the phosphorus flares. Muriel hadn't been succumbing to paranoia. He had been preparing for war. He had been fighting back. It was then that I heard it. A sound from the darkest corner of the shed, behind the hulking mass of the generator. A soft, wet, dragging noise. Sha-thump. Sha-thump. I raised the flashlight, its beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. My light fell upon a heap of discarded fabric. It was a ranger's uniform. Khaki shirt, forest, green trousers. The arrowhead patch on the sleeve was unmistakable. It was Frank Merrill's uniform. It was caked in mud, and something dark that looked like dried blood. And it was coated in the same pale, greasy residue I had found on the window. The dragging sound stopped. From the shadows behind the uniform, a low chuckle echoed in the confined space. It was a pleasant, familiar sound. It was the voice of the friendly old hiker who had come to my door. A wave of ice, cold realization washed over me. The visitor hadn't been looking for Frank. The thing wearing the old man's face, the thing that now wore Frank's voice, had come to see if the new ranger was as clever as the last one. It had come to see if I had figured out how to run the machine. My hand, shaking uncontrollably, closed around the grip of the modified flare gun. I was no longer a park ranger. I was a soldier in a war I didn't understand, inheriting a battle from a man who had already lost. And I was standing in his tomb. The chuckle that echoed in the cramped, musty confines of the shed was the last sound I ever expected to hear. It was warm, familiar, and utterly terrifying. It was the voice of the friendly hiker, the voice that had asked for Frank Merrill, a voice that was now emanating from the darkness behind the generator. My blood ran cold. My mind, which had been a whirlwind of fear, in confusion, suddenly snapped into a state of horrifying clarity. This was not a simple predator. This was a game, and I had just walked into the final play. "Clever," the voice said. The pleasant baritone, now laced with a chilling amusement. Much cleverer than the last one. Frank tried to reason with me. He thought if he understood me, he could stop me. He wrote it all down, didn't he? His little rules. My fingers tightened around the cold, modified grip of the flare gun. My flashlight beam trembled, cutting a frantic, useless path through the oppressive gloom. I could see nothing but the hulking silhouette of the generator and the discarded, blood-stained uniform of my predecessor. He even tried to fix the machine. The voice continued, a sigh of mock disappointment. He thought it could hurt me. He thought light and noise would drive me away. But you can't fight what you are, Ranger. And this place is me. The dragging sound started again, closer this time. Sh-thump. Sh-thump. It was the sound of something heavy and wet being pulled across the dirt floor. My survival instinct, the primal urge to flee, screamed at me to run, to get out of the shed and back to the false security of the locked cabin. But I was paralyzed, not by fear alone, but by a sudden, stark realization. The rules weren't just about keeping things out. They were about containment. The nightly lockdown, the radio silence, the warnings about the woods. They were all designed to keep the Ranger in, and the entity focused on a single, isolated point of pressure. Merrill hadn't been a jailer, he had been the bait. And now, so was I. What do you want? I managed to choke out, my voice a raw whisper. The chuckling returned, louder this time. Want? I don't want anything, Benjamin. I take faces. I take voices. I take memories. Frank gave me so many. He gave me his father. He gave me his fears. And in the end, he gave me himself. My mind flashed to the knot deer with its forward, facing eyes, the child's voice on the wind, the frantic radio call for help. They weren't illusions. They were lures. Facsimiles constructed from the stolen. Lives of those who had wandered too close to this place. The entity wasn't just in the woods. It was the woods. And in that moment, something inside me broke. The professional detachment, the years of training, the belief in a rational, ordered world. It all shattered. I was not a ranger anymore. I was not a steward of the land. I was a cornered animal, and I would not be taken. With a guttural yell that was more rage than courage, I raised the flare gun. I didn't aim at the sound. I aimed at the heart of the darkness. At the space behind the generator where the voice lived. That little toy. The voice mocked. Frank tried that too. You'll only burn yourself. I pulled the trigger. The world dissolved into white. It was not a flash, it was an instantaneous, violent erasure of reality. A deafening whoomph sucked the air from my lungs, and the shed was consumed by a light so intense, so pure, it felt like the birth of a star. The heat was a physical blow, searing my skin, and in that split second of blinding phosphorus fueled incandescence, I saw it. It was not one thing. It was a multitude. A wreathing, tangled mass of limbs that bent at impossible angles, a knot of stolen forms and half remembered faces, all screaming with a chorus of voices I recognized and ones I didn't. I saw the hiker, the not deer, the pale silhouette from the storm, all melting and forming in the terrible, cleansing fire. And at its core, I saw Frank Merrill's face, his eyes wide with a silent, eternal scream. Then, the sound hit me. A shriek that was not a single voice but a legion, a sound of pure agony and rage that tore at the very fabric of the air. It was the sound of 100 dying animals, of grinding metal, of a child's cry, all twisted into one unbearable chord. The creosote-treated walls of the shed, dry and ancient, erupted in flame. The oily, black wood acted like an accelerant, and the entire structure became an inferno in seconds. The heat was unbearable. I stumbled backward, my left arm, which had been closest to the blast, screaming in pain. I had to get out. I scrambled for the door, tripping over debris. My eyes streaming, my lungs burning from the acrid, chemical smoke. I burst out of the shed and collapsed into the cool, wet mud, gasping for air. Behind me, the fire roared, a pillar of white, hot fury against the blackness of the Appalachian night. It was a beacon, a declaration of war. I knew I couldn't stay. The rules were for surviving at the station. But I had just burned the station's darkest secret to the ground. The game had changed. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the pain. I staggered to my feet and ran for the main cabin. I didn't waste time on inventory or procedure. I burst through the door and grabbed my bag, my personal pack with my own supplies. On the desk, I saw Merrill's journal. I snatched it, shoving it into the bag. I grabbed the box of remaining phosphorus flares. I took the Skillcraft pen, a final, absurd piece of a life that no longer existed. I didn't take the government truck. It was part of the station, part of the trap. I ran to my own vehicle, my hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a sound of civilization, of escape. As I slammed the car into gear and tore down the muddy access road, my headlights cutting a frantic swath through the trees, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure was stumbling out of the roaring inferno. It was tall, impossibly thin, and it was on fire. The flames seemed to cling to it, not consuming it, but wearing it like a cloak. It raised a long, burning arm and pointed at me. It wasn't destroyed. It was awake, and it knew my name. I drove all night, pushing my car to its limits on winding mountain roads, not stopping until the sun began to stain the eastern sky. I pulled over on the shoulder of a deserted state highway, the engine ticking in the sudden silence. My arm was a mess of angry, blistering burns. My mind was a ruin, but I was alive. I took out Merrill's journal and the Skillcraft pen. I flipped to a clean page. My handwriting was a jagged, almost illegible scrawl, a mirror of the man who had come before me. I was no longer a ranger, bound by procedure and protocol. I was a survivor, a witness, a warning, and I began to write a new set of rules. Not for a place, but for the world. Rule 1. They wear the faces of the dead and the lost. Do not trust familiar smiles. Rule 2a. They speak with the voices of your loved ones. Do not listen. Rule 30. They are not in the woods. They are the woods. Rule 40. Some things are not meant to be understood, only survived. Rule 5f. If you see a strange fire burning in the deep wilderness, where no fire should be, do not investigate. Do not call for help. Turn around, drive, and pray it hasn't seen you too. I don't know what I am anymore, but I know what's out there, and it's hunting.